Hello and welcome to Let's Review. Last week I had intended to cover This War of Mine. Unfortunately, it turns out that game hates fraps with a passion. I could barely get it to record more than a couple of minutes at a time without it crashing. And as such, with no time to plan anything else, I decided I'd take the week. As such, it means that it is once again time to go digging in the crate. Those of you paying attention may have noticed that this week I was able to lift up my crate without almost giving myself a hernia. And the reason for that is fairly simple. The game that I want to cover this week actually comes from my other crate because it was for the PS2. The reason that I wanted to cover this game in particular was because a couple of weeks ago I actually got the chance to play Dungeons & Dragons for the first time in my life, and I actually really rather enjoyed the experience. As such, I felt the desire to talk about the first D&D based video game I ever actually played. Ladies and gentlemen, Baldur's Gate, Dark Alliance. Oh yes, I remember this one. Does your PS2 actually still work? Oh, it does. No thanks to you, admittedly. I'd appreciate it if you could avoid knocking it over the next time you clean. At least I clean. The layer of dust on it was fairly spectacular. In fact, I suspect that was the only thing keeping it upright. Dark Alliance is, as the name implies, set in the Forgotten Realms universe of the D&D world, and is centered around the city of Baldur's Gate. You take on the role of one of three heroes, a dwarven fighter, a human archer, or an elven sorceress. And while all three of them start off the same, they do start to feel reasonably different by the end, even if they do all use the same gear. A dwarven fighter has the same gear as an elven sorceress? In terms of armour, they certainly do. Some of the weapons are unique to an individual hero, but honestly it's not really that noticeable. But in terms of their special abilities, they are quite different. The fighter enters berserk rages, the sorceress throws around magic missiles, and the archer fires off like 10 arrows at once. And honestly, it works for the most part, although I would like to have seen more differences between the three heroes. I do remember that. I also remember the story not being affected significantly either. It isn't, but honestly, it's not a major problem, and there are one or two minor tweaks to some of the dialogue, but you won't really notice it that much. The story itself is fairly standard D&D fare, starting with a nice simple clean the rats out of the basement type quest. Actually, it's a literal clean the rats out of the basement type quest, but hey, what can you do? And it then spirals out to you taking on a potential world-destroying threat as the newest member of the Harpers. It's rather amazing how RPGs always somehow manage to make that transition, isn't it? It is, but to be fair, they've had a hell of a lot of practice at that by now. The main problem with the story, honestly, is that your main character has absolutely no personality, nor are there any interesting choices to make. And I honestly, if we had one or the other, that would have been fine by me, but having neither is kind of disappointing. I would assume that that is a consequence of giving you 3 potential player characters. That would be my bet as well. To be fair, the game does actually have some really good solid voice acting behind it, including a cast that has John Rhys-Davies and the late Tony Jay in it. And frankly, it would be a pretty solid story if it wasn't for the fact it ends on a really irritating cliffhanger ending, with our protagonist being flung somewhere new, and then it just suddenly ending. Frankly, it feels kind of incomplete. I am correct in saying that there is a sequel to this game, am I not? Yes, but I never had the opportunity to play that, so I can't honestly speak to how good or bad a follow-up it was, and whether or not it can allow the disappointing ending of this one. As it stands on its own, it has a tedious sequel bait ending, and I will always hate sequel bait endings. Honestly, Dark Alliance isn't that long, and for a D&D game, it's actually very, very simple. But it is a pretty good example of the hack and slash genre. It's very well put together, there's reasonable enemy variety, and it does encourage you to think about the best way to defeat certain foes, even if that's something as simple as using flame to counter ice, for example. Overall, it's definitely a highlight of my PS2 collection. Yes, but that is not really saying much, given that you own a copy of Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness. Granted, but hey, I've got some good stuff as well. I mean, those are good, and yeah, that was pretty good. So was this follow-up. Couple of other good bits and bobs in here. Look, I'll talk about the rest of my PS2 collection at some point in the future, I have no doubt about that. But for now, I think I can safely say that Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance was a good game, let down by a very disappointing ending. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to get back to recording this week's Let's Play, because we're going back to Patreon-sponsored review time again, ladies and gentlemen. I'll see you later.